前几天刚到杭州，第一时间去看了上映的传记电影《Michael》，评价两极，但我基本上认可他的取向，没有沉溺于天才及奇迹的陈词滥调，而是将镜头压低，贴近一个被家庭、资本与父权凝视共同塑形的身体。所谓美式的 From Rags to Riches， 在这里也体现出了一种代价叙事。每一次掌声都是对童年的一次回收，每一次舞步都是对父权的延迟复仇。电影似乎在回应一个更大的问题：当一个孩子被塑造成符号，他还能否拥有自我？叙事围绕 Michael 的精神弑父的情感核心展开。父亲既是暴君，也是经纪人，他是伤口，也是通往未来的扶梯。其实我们每个人都或多或少地经历过精神弑父，不管这个父是怎样的权威。一个人要真正找到自己的坐标，有一种舍我其谁的使命感，必须要从某一种精神支配结构中解离，才能够再次嵌入一个更宽阔的结构。我想这也是 Michael 曾经给我过的最大的启示。说回电影， Michael 的侄子 Jaffa Jackson 的表演值得称道。有几个瞬间，我似乎看到了一种几近通灵的再现，他能把握 Michael 那种被压抑后的能量泄露，身体渗出优雅与破碎之间的那一毫米的震颤。我曾3次拜访印第安纳盖里市的 Michael Jackson 的出生地，每一次经过那个去工业化的破败社区，都有一种新的感悟。而 Michael 早期的童年就是在这个曾经的钢铁重镇度过的。而在某种意义上， Michael 也是我的英语启蒙老师。以下是我此前回忆 Michael 如何引导我的英语学习之路。 A cassette tape. My English education did not begin, as schools would prefer, with a textbook. Or at least that is not how memory arranges it. In memory, it begins with a cassette tape. A cheap plastic case, a faded cover, a folded sheet of lyrics inside. Nothing about the object itself suggested importance. Yet on that cover was a name that seemed, even to a boy who knew almost no English, to carry an unusual charge. Michael Jackson. At school, English came to us in discipline forms. Grammar tables, vocabulary lists, exercises ordered neatly across the page. It was useful, certainly. It was necessary. But it arrived as something to master rather than something to inhabit. Michael Jackson's songs belonged to another order. They moved where grammar stood still. They breathed where exercises lay flat. I remember sitting beside a small tape recorder, rewinding again and again until I could catch the beginning of a line, following the printed lyrics with my finger as the song played. At the time, I would not have called this learning. I thought I was merely listening to music, and perhaps admiring a distant star. Now I am less sure. It may be more accurate to say that the songs were entering me by routes I could not then name, through rhythm, repetition, and the strange intimacy between sound and memory. Word by word, without much explanation, English settled somewhere inside me. It did not enter as school knowledge enters. It entered more quietly, and for that reason, perhaps more deeply. From cassettes to CDs. Soon the cassette tapes disappeared and CDs took their place. The sound became cleaner, the lyric booklets thicker, and my curiosity more systematic. I followed Michael Jackson from album to album. Off the Wall, Thriller, Bad, Dangerous, History. Believing at the time that I was simply following a musician across the stages of his career. Now I wonder whether I was not also following a language across possible moods. Seduction, fear, swagger, grief, tenderness. Then came the internet, and with it a new form of intimacy. I could listen to a song while reading the lyrics on the screen. Sometimes there were translations, sometimes annotations, sometimes only the raw lines themselves. My method became almost ritualistic. Play, pause, read, repeat. Play, pause, read, repeat. At the time, this felt like diligence. Looking back, it seems closer to apprenticeship. The deepest education often does not announce itself as education. Great artists rarely explain what they are doing. They simply do it with such freedom and exactness that your senses begin, without your consent, to reorganize themselves around their example. You believe you are admiring them. In truth, you are being formed by them. That, I think, was how Michael Jackson taught me English. Not by explanation, and not even by intention, but by a brilliance so complete that it altered the structure of my attention. When English became visible. One summer afternoon during middle school, our English training school rolled a television into the classroom and played Ghosts. I still remember the peculiar silence that fell over the room as the screen flickered on. What appeared before us was not merely a music video. It was something harder to classify. Theater, horror, metamorphosis, rhythm, all woven together. Body twisted, faces changed shape, and the music seemed almost to push the air itself. We sat there, fascinated and slightly uneasy, watching without quite knowing what it was we were witnessing. I remember the effect more clearly than the sequence of images. Until then, English had been for me largely a written thing, black marks on the white paper, something to parse and memorize. That afternoon, it acquired volume, movement, atmosphere. It seemed suddenly capable of inhabiting image and fear, gesture and metamorphosis. The language had not changed, of course. What changed was the scale on which I imagined it. That was the day the classroom ceased, for a moment, to feel like a classroom. It became something more unsettling and more inviting. A threshold, perhaps. I would not have had those words then. I only knew that English had grown larger than textbooks, and that whatever it was I had glimpsed on the screen, it had little to do with the tame version of language that lived in school exercises. 3 songs that grew with me. As I grew older, certain Michael Jackson songs began to change meaning. Or perhaps the song did not change, and I changed around them. What had first entered as excitement slowly returned as interpretation. The music remained where it had always been. The listener did not. Thriller. Thriller was my first great initiation. At first, I responded to it physically. The bass line, the choreography, the red jacket, the uncanny pleasure of being frightened in a controlled way. Only later, when I slowed down enough to read the lyrics carefully, did I notice that the song was constructing atmosphere with literary precision. It's close to midnight, something evil's lurking in the dark. Under the moonlight, you see the sight is almost at your heart. Words like lurking, evil, and midnight did not arrive as vocabulary items to be memorized. They arrived as shadow, tension, and cinematic pressure. I learned them not as entries in a dictionary, but as elements of a word. Looking back, I think Thriller was one of the first places where I realized that English could paint. Earth Song. Then came Earth Song, and with it a different register. Its language was plainer, but its plainness was not weakness. It spoke in questions, and that was precisely where its force lay. Not in theory, not in slogans, but in moral bewilderment before a wounded world. What about us? What about nature's worth? At the time, I did not yet possess the language of environmental ethics, sustainability, or animal rights. But I felt, without being able to systematize it, that the natural world could be wrong. The song did not argue so much as grieve. Years later, theory would give structure to that feeling. The feeling itself arrived earlier. Heal the World. Heal the World mattered to me in yet another way. Before graduating from Yale Middle School, I sang it on stage before thousands of teachers and students in New Year Gala. Its message was undeniably idealistic, perhaps even vulnerable in its sincerity. But that was part of why it mattered. Heal the world, make it a better place for you and for me and the entire human race. There are people dying. For about a minute, everything was steady. Then the melody moved into a key that did not fit my natural range, and my voice cracked. I remember the shock of that moment with unusual clarity. A performer knows at once when something had broken. At the time, what mattered was I did not stop. I finished the 6-minute song. The audience applauded, and I took the applause as kindness, perhaps even as recognition. Years later, I was less certain what exactly they recognized. Definitely not success, perhaps only persistence. A boy learning in public that the voice does not always obey the will, and continuing anyway. That too was a lesson, though not the lesson I'd imagined at the time. Milwaukee. Years passed, cassette players vanished, CDs became relics, music migrated into the invisible order of the digital world, where objects disappeared and only access remained. Yet the songs endured as certain songs do, waiting not in machines, but in memory. Then years later, in Milwaukee, thousands of miles from the room where I had once sat with that cheap tape recorder, I entered a theater to watch a musical honoring Michael Jackson. The lights dimmed, the first beat landed, and suddenly time ceased to behave like time. The songs returned: Beat It, Billie Jean, Smooth Criminal, Childhood. But they no longer arrived as recordings from adolescence. They arrived as something stranger, echoes that had survived me, and now returned to meet the person I had become. Sitting there in the dark, I realized that the English I had once learned syllable by syllable from lyric sheets and websites had gone so deep into me that it no longer felt learned. It felt lived. What he really taught me. For many years, I told myself that Michael Jackson had taught me English. The statement is not false, but it conceals as much as it reveals. What he taught me first was not grammar, not even vocabulary in the classroom sense. What he taught was a susceptibility to language, the capacity to receive it not merely as information, but as rhythm, pressure, image, feeling. Through his music, I encountered sound before explanation, cadence before analysis, imagination before certainty. Language arrived not first as a system to be mastered, but as an event in the senses. That may be why it stayed. What enters through wonder remains differently from what enters through discipline. I once thought this was simply a story about admiration, a boy enchanted by a global star. Now I suspect that it is too simple. It is also a story about formation, about how a great artist, without ever intending to educate you in any formal sense, can quietly alter the hidden proportions of your inner life. He changes what you notice, what you feel, what you take language to be capable of carrying. So no, Michael Jackson did not merely help me learn English. That way of putting it belongs to the language of outcomes, and what happened was stranger than that. He made language vibrate before it explained itself. He taught me that words are not only units of meaning, they are also movements of breath, shapes of feeling, pressures on conscience. And once language had entered a person in that form, to rhythm before rule, to wonder before method, it never entirely returns to being a mere instrument.